Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for South West farmers brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green, and today we're talking about grants, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, farming in protected landscapes, or FIPL as it's commonly known, and much more, particularly in light of announcements from DEFRA Secretary Emma Reynolds at the Oxford Farming Conference in January of this year. We'll also be talking about running a farm business without grants or subsidies, which is something that many in the pig and poultry sectors have done for many years. To discuss this, I'm joined by Jeremy Moody, who is Secretary of the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, and Nick Dymond from St Piran's Pork, based in St Erm in Cornwall. Gentlemen, it's great to have you here. Jeremy, first of all, welcome to the show. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Great pleasure to be here and to take your questions. I'm Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers. That is a professional body representing, briefing and qualifying agricultural valuers acting for owners and farmers in the agricultural and rural economy across the whole UK.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. It's great to have you on the show, and we're looking forward to hearing what else you've got to say. Nick, it's great to have you here as well. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your family, and your business, please?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Fourth generation farmer. My son will be the fifth. We're from a mixed farming background. In the 80s, like a lot of farmers, we decided that we needed to specialize in just one or two sectors, fairly typical of the time. We specialized in pigs and arable because they sort of go well together. And then we got on that sort of high input, high output model of farming, where we found that we were just on a treadmill chasing an elusive carrot, which we never quite managed to grasp, even though our performance was going up all the time. So was our borrowing and risk and exposure. I suppose it was about 10 years ago that I had what I call my Damascus Road moment, and listening to an Australian agronomist called Graham Sate talking about soil health, and I suppose not being terribly academic, I didn't question it. We tried it, was sort of fairly blown away by the results, and realised that perhaps there was another way to farm, and sort of really question what I feel was a broken model that we were pursuing. And so for the last 10 years, we've gradually been downsizing. We've kept the same acreage, but farming now without inputs. And we've managed to establish a brand for our pork, which we think is fairly unique, really, where we're growing all the cereals and proteins for the pigs, and then just taking that direct to market ourselves, or selling direct to local butchers who see a value in what we're doing and paying us a premium for it, which we're very grateful for.
Wow, what a story. And I've got to say, listeners, you can't see, but I am grinning from ear to ear, and I have goosebumps just listening to this, because Nick's telling us a story. Nick, I hope you don't mind me saying, to you, you've probably told this story again and again, and you know it, but actually when you hear this story for the first time, that's quite something. These are huge decisions that you were making to sort of come away from an input model, an extractive model, which is quite intensive, into something which is still trying to get a profit. We're not saying profit's a dirty word, but we're trying to do it in a different way. It's quite something. And I'm really looking forward to getting into this more with you on today's show. So thanks to you,
Peter.
Thanks for being here.
Pleasure.
So we'll go back right to the beginning, Jeremy. We're here to talk about sort of grants and subsidies and perhaps farming with and without them. We've heard a lot recently, and there's been announcements from the DEFRA Secretary Emma Reynolds, as we talked about in the introduction. What do the changes actually change that we've heard from her and from DEFRA more broadly in the last month or two since the beginning of December?
Well, so far, they tell you very little. What we have had is a machine, a little bit like a clockwork that's just wound down without being rewound since the last election. We had a capital grants application autumn in 24, which ran into the sand and was paused and then briefly reopened. We had the very abrupt cutting off of SFI applications March the 11th last year, 10 months ago. And then we had the least and latest possible statement on countryside stewardship in the autumn, simply telling people that they could be rolled forward for 1 year if they applied, when many had already taken decisions. We did have last July's capital grant scheme, and people with fingers burnt then piled into it, so the entire application money was more than taken up within the 4 weeks the scheme was open. And we're sitting here waiting for government to come forward. And what we had at Oxford was probably less than people thought that they had been told. We've had statements coming out, as you say, over the last couple of months, but particularly in Emma Reynolds' speech to the Oxford Farming Conference, pointing to a possible shape for SFI, that we will get details, i.e. what you actually need to know for you to make an application and whether it interests you or not. We get details sometime this spring. Now, whether that can be done with the NFU conference in a month's time or whether it's later, I think depends on how fast DEFRA can work inside and make its decisions. We then get a first application period with its own budget in June, and that is specifically limited to those who have not got into an ELM scheme already. And so that will include all the people who didn't get a scheme in last March and were cut off. So they're there. And then it's open to an undefined group called small farmers who could already be in a scheme or they might not be. But a definition of what makes a small farmer will entitle people to apply at that point. There is then to be a second window with a second budget that will open in September for everybody. So, in a sense, there is a concern that smaller farmers, however defined, haven't been able to get as ready a crack at the cherry. That may or may not be true. They're being given an advanced opportunity to go in. We think it's likely that there will be fewer options than under the present SFI. There are likely to be fewer options. They're likely to concentrate on the ones that people showed most interest in. They're likely to be perhaps consolidating some options. It is probable that payment rates are being reviewed, and I listen to the magic phrase, which is value for money. That suggests they might not be the payment rates that you saw last time.
When we hear reviewed, we're not thinking necessarily reviewed upwards, are we?
Not when it's mentioned for value for money.
No.
And there is also discussion of whether more options might be capped as to the area that they could take up, and whether indeed overall agreement payments might be capped. And I think the government's objective here is to try and get as many people into the scheme rather than to have as effective a set of answers as you might expect. That's a sketch of what we think we know.
Yeah.
But anything on which anybody could actually take a business decision hasn't been published.
Yeah, so we've had a few announcements, particularly those from Oxford. You summarised them brilliantly, thank you. And we had a discussion about the Oxford Farming Conference more broadly with Jeremy Oatey right at the beginning of this series, and we discussed to an extent there as well what quantified a small farmer or not. I farm about 50 hectares. Am I a small farmer or not? That the time will tell, and I'm probably going to be around about the cutoff there. But something I'm really interested with what the government look to be trying to do. The simplification I understand, but it does feel a little bit like we need to have some clarity over whether the government want everyone to be able to access SFI or whether they actually want farmers to really prioritise food production, because I don't know that the two go necessarily hand in hand. We won't go into that one right now, but I think that's a question that people just need to bear in mind and to be thinking about when they're getting in front of their elected representatives. Nick, I'll come to you now. We've had that reflection from Jeremy on what we've heard so far from DEFRA, particularly with reference to SFI. I don't want to ask too leading a question, but what sort of state do you think we're in from a farming and a planning point of view in terms of the extent to which there's certainty or uncertainty, opportunity or not? What do you think farmers feel at the moment?
I think most farmers would acknowledge that we're in quite a precarious position at the moment. Market volatility is as rife as ever, and we've seen that sort of particularly in the dairy sector, the arable sector of late, and right now the pig sector is experiencing that. there is always opportunity within agriculture because it's such a diverse industry, and there are always openings and opportunities. But I would say that uncertainty is the prevailing feeling, and the lack of information farmers feel they have to make bigger, longer term business decisions, whether it's investment, expansion, diversification, the sort of information that farmers need to make those decisions, and often to borrow long-term money, 5, 10, 15 years. It's really difficult for a lot of businesses to know where they're going to be in 12 months' time.
Yeah. And actually this lack of certainty and the need for more certainty was something that was really referenced quite loud and clear by Baroness Batters in her farm profitability review, which was released in December of 2025.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
which people I think would do well to look at. We have talked about that before. So Jeremy, coming to you, I mean, the sustainable farming incentive, it's supposed to be an incentive for farming in a sustainable way. You know, that's what they've called it. It feels like at the moment we don't necessarily have enough information to say whether or not it is actually able to perform. It's not able to do what it says on the tin. But are current grants able to make up for the lost basic payment income that farmers are now doing without?
I think a key point, and it links back to what Nick was saying, we don't actually have current grants. And I think that's a very important point to recognise. When we come to look at SFI, and the government does seem to like the label and want to carry it forward rather than invent a new name, but again, we wait to see, farmers should look at it purely as a business proposition. There was a pattern of people looking at that as a means to get their basic payment back, and that was always a nonsense. It was because these schemes were always there to buy change. They were to encourage you to do something on your farm that would require change, that might for many incur cost or forego income. Sometimes it might be worthwhile, as you know you've got to improve your soils, and if it helps you do that, that's good. Even if it doesn't bring you income, it's defraying cost. If it's paying you to do something you're going to do anyway, well, then that's attractive.
Yeah.
If you can accept the limit. But if it's paying you to do something that's an awkward change that doesn't fit with what you do, doesn't offer you a big enough margin to make it worthwhile, then you don't take it. These are options. They aren't salvation. And I think this is where we're looking at a very different relationship. And that's why this is a pivotal moment, a very different relationship between farmer and government. And some of this discussion of uncertainty is actually about farmers being used to looking to government for a level of guidance and framework that government itself is withdrawing from. And we've seen payments effectively removed over the last 12 months, one way and another. There are going to be more of these schemes, one way and another. They're possibly not of great scale. We wait to see and try to understand it. And it is for the farmer to look at this with a businessman's eye. Does this meet my objectives, personal, business, environmental, agricultural, whatever they are? And should I take it or not? And not taking it is as valid an option as taking it.
There's so much there that I want to go at. So the sustainable farming incentive is a form of quid pro quo. It's not just money for nothing. The government expected something in return, and by extension, the taxpayer that are giving the government those funds, and we were to produce public goods for that money. It's important to remember that wasn't money for nothing. You talked about not taking the funding as being an option which farmers should consider. So if there are options which could pay well but don't necessarily suit your farming system, then that's something that you should consider not doing. And actually, all the way back in Series 1, Episode 4 of Farming Focus, we spoke to Sabine McEwen and the Gills about the SFI as it was back then. I think that was sort of 3 years ago. And the advice was the same. Don't make the tail wag the dog. Make sure that the options that you go into work for you. And it's really interesting what you say, that we need to look at farming as a business. This is something I've heard again and again, particularly at the beginning of this year, 2026, that we're just starting out in. I think it's very easy for us as farmers to think of our businesses as a vocation, as something that we just love doing, and it's a pastoral idyll, and it will just sustain itself. It will not just sustain itself. We need to make sure we're making really good business decisions. Great stuff to go at there. Thank you, Jeremy. So, Nick, looking in from a sector, the pig sector, that it being one that sits outside of direct support, how does the current framework for other sectors look to you?
I mean, just picking up on one of Jeremy's many good points there, the situation now is that we're being encouraged to farm environmentally, and the payments, as Jeremy points out, are for rewards actions. They're not a top up for cheap food. For decades, we were just about able to produce food for just under cost of production, and the subsidy took us just over that cost of production to allow 70% of UK businesses to just fall the right side of the profitability line. So this system is unique, and I think that that's one of the difficulties that high input, high output farms face now, is we have become dependent, and it seems to be almost the automatic default to look at whatever scheme is being offered and to wonder how we might shoehorn that scheme into our existing high input, high output business. But so often the scheme will compromise that model far more than the rewards, particularly when the costs are taken into account of that particular scheme. So I think there is a real mindset challenge for farmers to get their head around. Actually, this subsidy might not be for us, and I think that's a great point that Jeremy raised. In terms of pig and poultry farms, well, obviously, yeah, they've never received direct support. A lot of pig and poultry units in the southwest do have land attached to them and have perhaps benefited from previous subsidy schemes and can benefit from this one. But the pig and poultry model, if any model, tends to be based on high input, high output. It's that. And I think it's built a mindset of resilience amongst those producers that are still left. But generally, pig and poultry farmers don't look or expect much from the government. And I think maybe that's the thing that sort of singles them out, perhaps from the mainstream, is that they tend not to protest too much. They tend to just get their heads down and get on with it. But that support hasn't been there, and it's frustrating for many because a lot of European pig and poultry farmers receive direct subsidies, which is why, for example, at the moment, Belgian pork is coming into the country at £1.10 a kilo. Our own producers are probably on about 175, and that's what they've got to compete with. So that is one of the difficulties with direct and indirect subsidies.
Yeah.
But not being subsidized hasn't done those industries any favors, because it has forced those farms to push the animals harder, increasingly reduce cost of production, and the only winner in that ever is the supermarkets.
Yeah. Interesting that you talk about the anti-competitive nature of European subsidies. We're recording this right at the end of January 2026, so those are when the dates are effective. But this is something that we are seeing. This is a trend at the moment that actually the EU is starting to come back around to a point where it's subsidising farmers for production again. And it's it's something which is quite challenging when we in the UK are being encouraged by government with grants for capital works and for nature-friendly farming. It's a completely different way of supporting farmers. So, Jeremy, on the different types of grants, when it comes to the different things which might be available for businesses to apply for in terms of grants, especially those through FIPL, the Farming and Protected Landscapes schemes, what is available and who can qualify for it?
Well, the clearest and best news on grants out from Oxford was the 3-year extension for FIPL. Farming and Protected Landscapes are basically those in national parks or AONBs, as Cornwall has, or indeed very close to either of those. It's not been an absolute cut-off. And FIPL is a scheme that just seems to have worked really very well, been appreciated, locally determined, and given people support for all sorts of business change and adaptation or environmental works. It's been very flexible. It was extended for a year until this coming March. It's now been extended for 3 years further, and that is just good and helpful news. It's been handled very practically. The issue has been in a sense, the extent to which people have wanted more from it than it can give for the money it has. There's a new farming collaboration grant scheme to come in for 3 years. That appears to be, is yet undefined, but it appears to be about encouraging farming learning, peer-to-peer learning from other farmers, and so forth. That appears to be there. Broadly, the indication was given that countryside stewardship hire tier is probably being left alone now to settle down for a while. But we wait to see. And of course, those people whose countryside stewardship agreements were simply rolled over for another year are now seeing the end of this year coming up on the horizon.
Yeah.
And wondering where they're to go and whether in the end they're being put into SFI. Picking up on one or two of the other themes, SFI is at the moment too insubstantial for many people as yet to want to think of building their own business around in response to it. So SFI then is a decision you make from where you start. But at the other end of the spectrum, the really long-term agreements, people then begin to see those as too much of a straitjacket to lock themselves into. And we keep coming back, I think probably both Nick and I keep coming back to this sense of the farmer actually looking at managing what's under his control. That's the one thing you've got responsibility for. The outside world will do whatever the outside world does, but it's what's within the ring fence is what you can control.
Yeah.
We used to call it closing the farm gate, didn't we? And it's back to that in a way.
Can you expand on that, please, Nick? Because that might sound a little bit like we're pulling up the drawbridge, we're not engaging with the community, and that's something that we definitely aren't necessarily being encouraged to do by many people. So can you just maybe give us a bit on the difference between those two things, please?
Yeah, definitely. It's closing the farm gate in an inputs sense, and it's literally just that. It's so important that we engage, and it's an important part of our brand and what we do at the farmers markets and on the socials, and it's a great opportunity for us to educate. So that's vitally important. But for us, as soon as we started to focus on margin rather than yield, and whether that was yield measured in terms of piglets weaned per sow per year or tons of wheat grown per hectare, as soon as we moved our focus away from those things towards just bottom line and margin, it all really just became an awful lot simpler. The cash flow smoothed out, so we didn't have these huge peaks in the year when we were having to pay a lot of money for fertilizers and sprays, seed, those sorts of typical arable inputs. And the cash flow is smoother and much easier to manage.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, and great to hear a lived example of a business where you've taken that step and you've moved from one place to the other. I'm sure it wasn't simple, but it does sound like it has worked for you. So thank you ever so much for sharing that. Thinking about what Nick's said, Jeremy, perhaps some people thinking about coming away from arable and perhaps more intensive, machinery-intensive operations. We know that the arable price at the moment isn't giving people a lot of hope for sticking with that industry. And we're hearing stories of historically low numbers of tractor registrations coming from people that I spoke to that have just been to the Llama machinery event recently. From your perspective, are farms cutting back on investment, or is there still hope and cause for them to invest given the right type of asset?
I think they are cutting, but they have been over the last 16 months been cutting back on investment. There was an overnight shock effect from the October 2024 budget regarding inheritance tax, and a whole lot of plans were promptly put on ice. And you just go talk to machinery dealers and you look at changes in that market where they carry their own extra costs around national insurance and other factors. There's just been a cold draft blowing through, but the sense of people's first reaction to the inheritance tax announcements was to pull their horns in. Building projects got cancelled. I heard of a farmer who was looking at a building project and said to the builder, "When can he come?" And the builder said Monday. It was that striking, simple and novel.
Gosh.
Since then, as you say, I think you are looking then more at it sector by sector. Combinable cropping has gone through, in many parts of the country, has gone through 2 grim, sodden years and 1 hot, dry year. And so they've had a series of difficult harvests at prices that, well, the price now would 10 years ago have been £120 a tonne after inflation. Now that brings it back to, we too easily look at the cash price, not the real price after inflation.
Yeah.
And that shows how it's eroded because there have been strong harvests elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem for there. And at that point, capital expenditure becomes much harder to afford. The dairy shock is more recent, and people can know more about riding out these cycles. We've still got very strong beef prices, particularly, and that's a global shortage of beef. And I would be encouraging livestock farmers to be thinking about how they sort their costs now while they're in a better position than they might be when they're forced to look at their costs.
Yeah.
The cycles will turn. We've been through these things, and it may be simply a consumer reaction to move to chicken from beef or whatever it might be, but they are in a position where it's worth thinking now about the 7 lean years.
So our final question, Nick, I'm going to come to you. We've talked about a lot today in a lot of different areas, so please feel free to throw in any final thoughts. But from me, in 5 years' time, are we going to be looking back on this period as a turning point for farmers? And how do you hope that things will look then?
Absolutely. Yeah, we will look back upon this period as a very pivotal time. The change in subsidies, things like the IHT protests that have been going on. I think we will look back at it, probably not fondly, but as a defining point in recent history. I hope that the SFI can evolve into something which genuinely helps all farms to take a focus away from production towards enhancing what they're doing, perhaps to think about the legacy of perhaps the soil, the environment that they're leaving behind. How most farms do that when they're completely under the cosh of production cost and output is difficult to see. But if it doesn't achieve that, then it's not fit for purpose. Back when Michael Gove coined that phrase, which we keep repeating, public money for public goods, surely that was what that taxpayers' money was aimed at doing. It wasn't aimed at suddenly converting thousands of hectares of arable land into herbal lays just because it was a useful cash cow and the option that perhaps was the easiest to land the biggest subsidy payments. And I'm delighted to see this sort of revamping, rethinking of the SFI. And I think this will probably go on for several years yet to really identify where that money is best spent, what the best targets are, and hopefully farmers will sort of get their heads around trying to make it work without impacting on the core business, but working with it, letting it enhance the business rather than just being a bolt on the side, which they begrudgingly do just to lever the cash.
Yeah, yeah. So what we are calling for actually there, or what you're calling for, it sounds like, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, is mindset change. You alluded to it in the episode, but actually people really need to reevaluate their outlook in 2 ways. Number one, think about what we're leaving behind. And also, we've heard today, think about your business as just that, a business. Gentlemen, thank you so much. You've been such fantastic guests. I could keep talking to you all day, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So, thank you very much to you, Jeremy Moody, and to you, Nick Dymond, for giving us so much food for thought.
Thank you both.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
So what an incredible conversation we've had today with Jeremy Moody and Nick Dymond. It's been so enjoyable for me, but I now need to try and come up with some of my highlights. It definitely feels like we are in a pivotal era. We're at a point where businesses in farming need to be just that, and where we need to be reimagining what we are and how we do things. And actually, Nick spoke about the need for mindset change, about the way he thinks about his legacy and what's going to be left behind on his farm, and how he's come away from a place of thinking just about production. It's an interesting challenge for all of us, and I think it's definitely something that bears thinking on and meditating on after today. And also, there was an interesting piece around the lack of payments that we are getting from the government at this present moment and how there are no schemes or very few schemes open. And actually, this is a huge opportunity. We have a choice, but no imperative on how to act. People have been used in our industry to looking to the government for a framework on what we need to do and how and when. But actually, we are in uncharted territory in that we have the opportunity to decide which way our businesses go. We need to make sure that our mindset is in a position so that we see this as the opportunity that it is, and that our businesses and the people within them are fit for purpose and ready to go forward in that way.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Join us next week for a bonus episode when we'll be asking, how can farms insulate themselves against sudden changes such as the removal of support? We would love to hear from you with any feedback about the podcast, be it questions or suggestions. So if you'd like to get in touch, do email us on podcast@cornishmutual.co.uk. Do take a look at the show notes for more information on today's episode, including the link to our podcast disclaimer. You've been listening to Farming Focus, brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I've been Peter Green. Until next time, it's goodbye from me and everyone in the Cornish Mutual podcast team.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.